Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Great Exhibition of 1851. It may not look like much, but I can assure you there's more here than meets the eye. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the Crystal Palace, a grand hall of glass and metal where our Great Exhibition is held. But I'm afraid I haven't been entirely honest with you. The year is not 1851, it's 2024, and the Great Exhibition has long since come to a close. However, the image of the Crystal Palace and all that it represents remains. For you see, ladies and gentlemen, the Great Exhibition of 1851 and the Crystal Palace changed the world. But what was the Great Exhibition anyway? In many ways, the Great Exhibition was nothing but an elaborate tourist attraction. Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, organized the exhibition to show off the British Empire's might and to impress other nations in the hopes of driving increased international trade and solidifying London as the cultural, economic, and technological center of the world. Prince Albert and the British Empire got exactly what they wanted, and the Great Exhibition heralded a new age of expansion and exploitation for England, and setting a precedent that future world powers would follow. Now that you know the history of the Great Exhibition, let's examine it through the eyes of the people who lived to see the Crystal Palace in its prime. In his famous 1855 ballad, The Crystal Palace, English novelist, poet, and illustrator William Makepeace Thackeray captures the feelings of national pride that the Great Exhibition elicited in those who witnessed it. Thackeray says, "This palace tall, this crystal hall, which emperors might covet, stands in Hyde Park like Noah's Ark, a rainbow hint above it." Here, Thackeray paints a picture of a majestic and awe-inspiring piece of architecture. The line about emperors and what they might covet cues us into a deeper truth. The Great Exhibition was rooted in empire. In 1851, the British Empire was in its prime with substantial colonies in Canada, Australia, India, and South Africa. In the years following the Great Exhibition, the empire greatly expanded its presence to Africa, India, Australia, and New Zealand. The British Empire reached its peak in around 1920, controlling about a quarter of the Earth's land area. The British Empire reached its peak in around 1920, controlling about a quarter of the Earth's land area, and the Great Exhibition helped to make that happen. Prince Albert hoped that the leaders of other nations would be so impressed by the Crystal Palace and the British Empire that they would covet it, opening the door for more international trade. Thackeray's ballad makes it clear that the Great Exhibition did just that, inspiring awe and a showcase of the British Empire's cultural and technological might. Thackeray says, "So let us raise Victoria's praise and Albert's proud condition, that takes his eyes as he surveys this crystal exhibition." Here, Thackeray describes the pride Albert must have felt for his empire when looking at the majesty of the Crystal Palace. And given that the Great Exhibition was a massive success for the British Empire, many British citizens and tourists alike must have felt the same way. While the Crystal Palace was under construction, British photographer and illustrator Philip Henry Delamet was hired to document its progress. In doing so, Delamet created a series of illustrations showing the grandeur of the Crystal Palace that had been preserved in Wyatt M. Digby's 1854 book, Views of the Crystal Palace and Park Sydenham. While all of Delamet's pieces are fascinating windows into the past, his illustration of the northern transept of the Crystal Palace is of particular interest. Here, we see a massive hall within the Crystal Palace, lined with palm trees, ancient Egyptian-style architecture, and 61-foot statues. At first, it may seem strange that such a large portion of the Great Exhibition, an event designed to showcase the might and industry of the British Empire, was filled with and focused on ancient Egyptian artifacts, given that Egypt was not part of the British Empire at the time. Indeed, much of the Crystal Palace was filled with artifacts that had nothing to do with the British Empire, the land that it controlled. But that didn't matter. As long as the Crystal Palace wowed visitors, it was a success. You may notice that there's something about Delamet's illustrations that call to mind a theme park attraction, much like one might expect to find at Disneyland. And that isn't a coincidence. The Great Exhibition became the first in a series of international showcases known as World's Fairs. For over a century, these World's Fairs were held across the globe, drawing in tourists and letting nations show off their industrial, scientific, and cultural progress. As technology became more advanced and the scale of World's Fairs grew, they began to feature rides like those found at Disneyland. In fact, Walt Disney himself designed 4 attractions for the 1964 New York World's Fair, all of which were moved to and became staples of his theme park. Delamet's illustrations are reminiscent of Disneyland because the Great Exhibition was, in a very real sense, like Disneyland. It sterilized and mixed histories and cultures from around the world together, often inaccurately, to impress guests, accrue capital, and expand. And it worked. Like Disney, which now operates 6 resorts and 12 theme parks across 3 continents, the British Empire expanded greatly after the Great Exhibition, eventually invading and occupying Egypt in 1882. Not everyone was impressed by the Great Exhibition, though. One of these people was Charlotte Bronte, the prolific author of Jane Eyre. Bronte wrote of her experiences at the Great Exhibition in several letters, one of which has been preserved in Clement Shorter's 1896 book, Charlotte Bronte and Her Circle. Writing to her friend Miss Wooler, Bronte says, "Do not press me much on the subject of the Crystal Palace. I went there 5 times and certainly saw some interesting things, but I was never able to get up any raptures on the subject, and each renewed visit was made under coercion rather than of my own free will. It is an excessively bustling place, and after all, its wonders appeal too exclusively to the eye and rarely touch the heart or the head." While the Great Exhibition was full of wonders, Bronte felt that it wasn't thought-provoking or emotionally resonant. It was hollow. Perhaps Bronte was underwhelmed by the Great Exhibition because she was a well-known critic of the Victorian society it sought to show off. If Bronte wasn't impressed with the British Empire, then she would have had no reason to be impressed by an event so evidently designed to sell it to the world. Now we have heard the history of the Great Exhibition and experienced it through the eyes of those who lived to see it in its prime. But what was the Great Exhibition really like? Well, Thackeray's ballad, Delamitte's illustrations, and Bronte's letter all paint pictures of a small part of the Great Exhibition that, when united, show the reality of the greater whole. The Great Exhibition was grandiose but hollow. It was representative of the British Empire's might, but it contained wonders that belonged to other lands. It was designed to sell that empire to the world, to be something that all other nations would covet, and to solidify London as the industrial, scientific, and cultural capital of the world. And it worked. For that, the world was forever changed.